My mom challenged me to make a dish out of 5 random ingredients. First, I chose vinegar, and then I chose pomegranate, then I chose eggs, then I chose syrup, so I went with like a vanilla syrup, and lastly, I chose sugar. I've never worked with a pomegranate before, so this is gonna be interesting. First, I had to get the seeds out of the pomegranate, so I peeled the top off and then cut it into slices. And then I basically just beat the seeds out of it and put it in a food processor to get the juice out of it. I pulsed the food processor about 3 times, and then I used a mesh strainer to separate the seeds from the liquid. In a small pot, I made pomegranate syrup, and I set it aside to thicken. Then I used my piggy tool to separate 3 egg whites, and I used a hand mixer until it was frothy. Then I added about 2/3 cup of sugar, and I also added some vanilla syrup and some vinegar. And then I dumped the bowl upside down to make sure it was ready. I spooned the mixture onto my lined baking sheet, and I drizzled my pomegranate syrup on top. Then I put them in the oven, and when I tasted them, they tasted so good, I had to dance. Let's make a meal out of 5 random ingredients. First, I chose coffee, so I went with instant coffee. Then I chose ice cream, so I went with vanilla. And then I chose peanut butter. Then it got super weird. I chose tortillas, so I went with cinnamon sugar. And lastly, I got wild card, so I picked maple syrup. First, I tried to make peanut butter cookies with peanut butter and maple syrup. In theory, this was a good idea because it formed a nice dough, so I formed it into balls and I pushed it down with the palm of my hand. Then I stuck it in the oven. After it finished baking, I started on my coffee ice cream, where I literally just poured instant coffee into ice cream and mixed it up. I spread on my ice cream and crushed up some tortillas to put on the edge of my cookies.
Oh, no. It's breaking. Bon appetit. Ew! I need some water. Okay, those cookies are nasty.
My mom challenged me to make a meal out of pumpkin and 4 random ingredients. First, I chose coconut, so I went with coconut milk. Next, I chose coffee, so I went with instant coffee. And then I chose waffles, so I went with Belgian waffle mix. And lastly, I chose wild card, so I went with Cool Whip. Let's get started. Today, I'm making my waffles with coconut milk, and the rest of the ingredients are actually necessary to make the waffles, so yes, this is a legal move. Next, to flavor the waffles, I added a little bit of pumpkin in and I whisked it all together. One by one, I made my pumpkin waffles, and lastly, I made a pumpkin latte whipped dip with, you guessed it, Cool Whip pumpkin and instant coffee.
This is like delicious looking. Let's see how it tastes. Oh my God. That is so good. That's really good. Thanks.
My mom challenged me to make a meal for our whole family with only $10, but I wanted Italian food, and that's expensive. First, I picked up some Alfredo sauce for $1.88. Then I grabbed some marinara sauce for the same price. I grabbed a box of noodles for 78 cents, some ground sausage for $1.88, and lastly, some mozzarella cheese for $1.98, coming to a grand total of
$8.40. Yes.
Woo! I started by boiling some water and cooking the pasta, and while I waited for that, I cooked the sausage. I also made sure to add some Italian seasoning, and I cooked some more. I drained and rinsed the noodles. Then I combined my meat, my marinara sauce, and my Alfredo sauce. Once it was all mixed, I folded in the noodles. I wanted to make sure they were fully covered. Then I poured some pasta into the casserole dish and spread some cheese on it. This literally costed less than $10 to make, and it's so yummy. Let's make a meal out of pumpkin and 4 random ingredients. First, I chose butter, so I went with unsalted butter. Then I chose cupcakes, so I went with vanilla cake mix. After that, I chose sugar, so I went with powdered sugar. And lastly, I picked chai tea. The first thing I did was brew my chai tea. Then I made my cupcakes. All of these added ingredients are needed to make the cupcakes, so yes, this is a legal move. I used my chai tea as my liquid for my cupcakes, and I mixed it all together. Now it's time to fill my cupcake tray and put it in the oven. Next, I made my pumpkin buttercream frosting with, you guessed it, butter and pumpkin. After I mixed those together, I added in some powdered sugar, and voila. Let's give it a try.
That is so good!
My mom challenged me to make a meal out of 5 random ingredients. First, I picked apple pie, so I went with apple pie filling. Then I chose cookies, so I went with ginger snaps. After that, I picked the card granola bar, so I went with granola. Then I picked rolls, so I went with cinnamon rolls. And for the last card, my mom challenged me to use pumpkin. First, I sprayed down a pan and laid out my cinnamon rolls. Then I spooned my apple pie filling on top and I stuck them in the oven. Now it's time to work on my pumpkin pie icing. I just mixed a little bit of my pumpkin pie filling into the icing and I drizzled it on top. After that, I added some ginger snaps and granola into a food processor and I blended it until it was a fine powder.
Okay, so might have cooked it for too long. Bon appetit. I have to say, I like it. Yeah, okay. That's good. I actually really like this combination. Even the burnt bottom.
Let's make a meal out of 5 random ingredients. First I pulled cookies, so I went with the best kind of cookies. And then I picked milk, so I went with condensed milk and heavy cream. After that I pulled tea, so I went with chai tea. And then I chose nutmeg. And lastly I chose cheese, so I went with cream cheese. Let's do this. I started by bringing my heavy cream to a boil. I emptied all my chai tea packets into a measuring cup and I poured it into my simmering cream. I mixed it all together with some nutmeg and I let it steep. So I poured it through a mesh strainer until the leftovers looked like this. Then I whipped my chai cream and I poured out my condensed milk. I spooned my whipped cream into my condensed milk and I mixed it together. I put my cream cheese and what was left of my cookies into a food processor and I formed them into balls. I poured my ice cream mixture into a bread tin and I sprinkled in my cookie balls. Then I covered it with parchment paper and I said goodbye till the morning. Now it's time to give it a taste.
It kind of feels like I'm eating straight condensed milk. I'm gonna give this a 5 out of 10. A little Cassie hands.
Let's make a meal out of 5 random ingredients. First I pulled cheesecake, so I went with a cheesecake slice. And next I pulled lemon, so I grabbed a lemon. After that I pulled fruit punch. Then I pulled honeydew melon. And lastly I chose jam. This is gonna be interesting. First, I sliced off the graham cracker crust and I put it at the bottom of a mason jar for a parfait type of thing. Then I dumped my cheesecake into a bowl with a little too much fruit punch powder and mixed it together. I squeezed a lemon in there for some extra liquid, and by that point it was looking pretty gross. I was a little disappointed with the fact that this didn't really fill the mason jar, so I put it into a clear bowl instead, and I spooned some jelly on top. Then I tried to sweeten it with my honeydew melon, but this was just not looking good.
Oh, that tastes like a sorbet, but in the wrong way.
Let's make a meal out of 4 random ingredients. The first card I picked was French toast, so I went with French toast sticks. After that I chose milk, so I went with butter. And after that, I picked donuts, so I went with chocolate donuts. And lastly, I chose almonds. This is gonna be a mess. First, I blended up some almonds. And then I did something I really regretted by blending up a chocolate donut. Then I prepped some frying oil. And then I dipped my French toast in melted butter, crushed almonds, melted butter again, and my crushed donuts. This is quite literally a hot mess. Lastly, I dumped it in some frying oil and, well...
So, all of my coating, I think, came off of it. Let's try it. It'll just taste like French toast. I'm so sad that that didn't work out. None of that stuff mixes well together.
Marshmallow's trying my marshmallow dessert. And after he loved it, he challenged me to make a meal out of 5 random ingredients. First, he chose pecans, then he chose wild cards, so I went with brown sugar. And then he picked French toast, so I picked some frozen toast. He picked pear. And lastly, he chose honeydew melon. So here's what I did. I toasted my French toast, and while it was toasting, I cut up my pear. After my French toast was toasted, I cut up my honeydew melon and I put it in the food processor to make juice. Then I made a brown sugar glaze with my honeydew melon juice, and I added up my chopped up pears and some pecans. I made sure the pears and pecans were evenly coated with the brown sugar syrup, and I put it on top of my French toast.
Oh my god.
It was amazing. I just had to do the Cassie dance. Thanks, Marshmallow. Let's make a meal out of 5 random ingredients. First, I picked cereal, so I went with Reese's Puffs. After that, I chose fudge brownie. Then I pulled chocolate spreads, so I went with my favorite milk chocolate frosting. Then I picked pastry, so I went with croissants. And lastly, I chose peanut butter. This is gonna be interesting. First, I combined all the ingredients necessary to make my brownies and I put them in the oven. When they were finished baking, I shredded the brownies and I added it into a bowl with some chocolate frosting, which ended up looking like poop. Next, I cut my croissant dough into long rectangles. Then I spread my chocolate filling on the inside and rolled it up like a cinnamon roll. Now it's time to crush up some. So I melted some peanut butter, dipped my chocolate roll into it, and sprinkled some cereal on top.
Interesting. The peanut butter is not fitting. I'm curious to know what it tastes like without the peanut butter. That's good. So there you have it. Deuces.
Let's make a meal out of 5 random ingredients. First, I pulled chocolate truffles. And after that, I picked cherry, so I went with maraschino cherries. After that, I pulled hot chocolate. And then I pulled cupcakes, so I went with chocolate fudge cake mix. And lastly, I chose waffles. Interesting group of ingredients, but I think I have an idea. I started by mixing together all the ingredients needed to make my cupcakes. Then I poured my cupcake batter into the cupcake tin and I dropped truffles in the center of the batter. While those baked, I made my hot chocolate with heavy whipping cream. But instead of mixing it together, I whipped it together. And I think I just made a revelation. Next, I toasted my waffle, I spread my hot chocolate whipped cream on top, and I topped it all off with a chocolate cupcake and a maraschino cherry.
That's really good. That hot chocolate whipped cream makes the world go round. Holy cow.
Let's make a meal out of 5 random ingredients. First, I picked the card grapes, so I went with grape jelly. And after that, I chose muffins, so I went with blueberry muffins. Next, I chose candy, so I went with the best candy, Sour Patch Kids. And then I chose yogurt, so I went with frozen yogurt. And lastly, I chose butter. Let's do this. In a large mixing bowl, I combined my butter and ice cream, which didn't look the best. Next, I put a 1/3 cup of my blueberry muffin mix to make a dough. I wrapped my dough in some saran wrap and I put it in the fridge to let it solidify, which didn't really work. I did my best to roll it into flattened cookie shapes and I spooned some jelly into the centers of it. Then I pinched my cookies closed and I baked them. Yeah, these didn't turn out well, but I put my Sour Patch Kid on top and gave it a bite.
It's not bad. It tastes like a Pop-Tart. It's not worth it. The best part about that whole meal is Sour Patch Kids. That's my conclusion.
My friend Kings challenged me to make a meal out of 5 random ingredients. First, I chose apples, so I went with apple juice. And then I chose donuts, so I went with the best kind of donuts. After that, I chose grapefruit, so yeah. But then I chose wild card, so I went with sugar. And lastly, I chose waffles, so this one's gonna be a little weird. I started by peeling and cutting my grapefruit to make a grapefruit jelly, flavored with apple juice and sweetened with sugar. Then I started on my donut. I cut my glazed donut in half and I spread my grapefruit jelly inside of it. Next, I made my funfetti waffle batter. I put the donut in the waffle maker and I filled its hole with waffle batter. And while it looked cool, the grapefruit jelly was not a success.
On all levels, I hate this.
Let's make a meal out of 5 random ingredients. The first card I picked was cinnamon rolls. And next I picked butter, so I chose unsalted butter. After that I chose cookies, so I went with pre-made cookie dough. Next I chose hot chocolate, so I went with the hot chocolate packets. And lastly I chose peaches. The first thing I did was grease and line a square baking tin. And I flattened my cookie dough into the pan. Next I laid out my cinnamon rolls on top of my cookie dough. And I brewed some hot water in a Christmas cup for my hot chocolate. Don't come at me, I celebrate Christmas year-round. Next, I painted my hot chocolate on top of my cinnamon rolls and I stuck them in the oven. While that was cooking, I browned some butter and caramelized my peaches. When my cinnamon roll cookies were finished baking, I poured my caramelized peaches on top and I gave it a try.
Out of 10.
Let's make a meal out of 5 random ingredients. The first card I picked was Eclair, and then I chose chocolate cake, so I went with super moist cake mix. After that, I chose strawberries, and then I chose honey, and lastly, I chose croissant. I started by spraying and lining all of the holes of a muffin tin. Next, I washed and chopped my strawberries. Next, I unrolled my croissant dough, and I tried to stretch it into a circle. Now it's time for something crazy. I blended my eclairs to make a moist, crummy frosting, and then inside each croissant hole, I layered honey, strawberry, and my blended up eclairs. Now let's make that chocolate cake. After all the ingredients were mixed, I filled up my croissant holes and I stuck it in the oven. Now all we have to do is try it.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
Yup, it was so good that I had to do my Cassie dance.
That is so good. I'm gonna give that like a 9 out of 10.
Let's make a meal out of 5 random ingredients. First, I chose jam, so I went with strawberry jam. After that, I chose peanuts. Then I chose milk, so I went with heavy cream. After that, I chose noodles, so I went with lasagna noodles. And lastly, I chose apricot. I think I have an idea. Let's start by putting some heavy cream in a pot and bringing it to a boil. Next, I added in a little bit of lemon juice to curdle the heavy cream, because right now we are making mascarpone cheese. After its ice bath, I put the cheese in a strainer overnight to get rid of any unwanted liquids. The next day, I combined 2 cups of water and 1 cup of powdered sugar in a pot, and I brought it to a boil. Then I added in my lasagna. While the lasagna was cooking in sweetened water, I combined my mascarpone cheese and my strawberry jam. Here's where things got weird. I tried to juice my apricots and make a reduction sauce out of them. So while that cooked, I cut and rolled my lasagna noodles into cannoli shells, and I filled them with my mascarpone and jam filling. I strained my apricot juice and I crushed some peanuts up in a baggie, and well, let's taste it.
Bon appetit! On all levels, that was disgusting.
Let's make a meal out of 5 random ingredients. First, I picked roast beef, so I went with sandwich meat. After that, I chose bacon strips. Then I chose bell pepper. After that, I chose potato. And lastly, I chose garlic, so I went with minced garlic. While I boiled some water, I washed and peeled my potato. Next, I cut the potato into cubes and I cooked it in the boiling water. After draining my cooked potatoes, I mashed them with an immersion blender. Next, I cut up my bacon strips and my roast beef and I mixed them into my mashed potatoes. Then I gutted my bell pepper and I put my mashed potato mixture inside. My mom challenged me to make a meal out of 4 random ingredients. I chose the word pastry, so I got puff pastry. And then I had to pick a cereal, so I chose the best cereal out there. I also had to pick a candy, so I chose white chocolate. My mom made me put back one of them. And then I chose butter, and I was like, what do I do with this? So now I'm making a meal out of butter, puff pastry, white chocolate, and Fruity Pebbles. How on earth do I go about this? I started by taking the frozen puff pastry out of the box and cutting both sheets down the center. Once they had thawed, I rolled them out, and I spread softened butter all over them. Next, I rolled the buttered puff pastry into tight logs. I cut those rolled logs into fourths, and then I rolled it like a cinnamon roll and put it in a muffin pan. I put my biscuits in the oven at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. I poured out a cup of Fruity Pebbles, and I began to melt my white chocolate. Once my biscuits had cooled, I dipped them in white chocolate and then in the Fruity Pebbles to make this cute dessert. My mom challenged me to make a meal out of 5 random ingredients. First, I chose parsley, and then I chose pita bread. After that, I chose barbecue sauce, and then I chose chives, and lastly, I chose ground beef. I think I have an idea. I started by de-stemming my parsley and cutting up my chives. I toasted 1 pita bread and I blended it to make pita breadcrumbs. And then I used my hands to mix together the ground beef, breadcrumbs, chives, parsley, and barbecue sauce. I used gloves for this part because I am touching raw meat and it does get messy. I browned my meatballs and added some barbecue sauce, and voila!
Oh my gosh, that is so good!